Of all of America's foes, Cuba is the strangest. Third only to Mexico and Canada in terms of distance from the US, for over 60 years this island country has posed itself as an opponent to everything the United States stands for. But as late as 1955, nobody in the US thought Cuba, of all countries, would fall to communism. The satellite countries of Russia are the unhappiest places in the world, so far as we can find out from the information that comes from behind the Iron Curtain. This is in sharpest contrast with the situation that exists in Cuba, Canada, Mexico, and other nations that lie in the portion of the world of which we are a part. No neighbor of ours is afraid of us, and they like to do business with us because we accept their competition instead of demanding their subjugation. But the revolution that tore Cuba from America's sphere of influence didn't come out of nowhere. And even though the claims of US interference in internal affairs by Castro and his sycophants was overblown, especially by the 1950s, those exaggerations come from a real history. Over the 19th century, the Cubans revolted against Spanish rule several times, but it would be their attempt in the 1890s that would garner the most attention. A combination of exaggerated horror stories in the media, today called yellow journalism, lobbying from Cuban emigre communities in Florida and New York, as well as an eagerness for martial virtue from progressives and nationalists such as Teddy Roosevelt, led to President William McKinley asking Congress to declare war against Spain in 1898. And by the end of that year, the US was in control of the Spanish colonies of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. After the war, the US would occupy Cuba, not allowing them to govern themselves until they drafted a constitution that the United States felt satisfied with. This ended up including the infamous Platt Amendment, named for Connecticut Senator Orville Platt, which asserted the right for the US to militarily intervene in Cuba. The government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty, and for discharging the obligations with respect to Cuba imposed by the Treaty of Paris on the United States to be assumed and undertaken by the government of Cuba. This amendment to the Cuban Constitution is the root of all claims about interfering in Cuban affairs. But as we will see in a little bit, those claims are complicated, including in ways that contradict the popular narrative. However, the other part of this, of course, was American business interests. The economies of Cuba and the United States were intertwined long before either were independent countries, and after the Spanish-American War, they grew even closer. More traditional investors bought land and sugar mills, bringing in modern equipment, while others built hotels and casinos to attract and service tourists. By 1907, nearly 60% of rural Cuba was owned by foreigners, and by the 1930s, nearly 80% of the sugar industry was owned by American companies. In 1924, one of Cuba's independence fighters, Gerardo Machado, became president, and although he had built his political career on anti-American rhetoric, his administration would be ensconced in corruption involving American businessmen, and would amend the Cuban Constitution to empower the president and extend their term in office, which would set off popular opposition, which would explode across all of Cuba after the stock market crash of 1929 collapsed commodities prices, gutting the sugar industry. Despite the growing disorder in Cuba, the Coolidge and Hoover administrations were willing to look the other way so long as Machado could protect U.S. citizens and property. Presidents Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson had been very quick to resort to military intervention in Latin America, but over the 1920s, the frequency of interventions drastically slowed, to the point where no new interventions occurred under Hoover, and this ship would be solidified under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The essential qualities of Pan-Americanism must be the same as those which constitute a good neighbor, namely, mutual understanding and, through such understanding, a sympathetic appreciation of each other's point of view. It is only in this manner that we can hope to build up a system of which confidence, friendship, and goodwill are the cornerstones. Each one of us must grow by the advancement of civilization and social well-being, and not by the acquisition of territory at the expense of any neighbor. Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who had served in the occupation of Cuba after the Spanish-American War, saw U.S. interventionism as the root cause for anti-Americanism in Latin America, and sought to pull U.S. troops out of where they were already stationed, and to not deploy them anywhere new. Cuba was to be the kernel of our new positive policy toward Latin America throughout the year. Our actions toward Cuba would prove the rest of Latin America whether we were sincere in our protestations of non-intervention. In the summer of 1933, things came to a head in Cuba, with violent resistance in rural areas, general strikes in the cities, and assassination of police and other government officials. President Machado was in talks with the U.S. ambassador, who was trying to get him to step down, but after a failed attempt to rally the public in his favor by claiming the U.S. was planning to intervene, the Cuban military gave him an ultimatum to step down or be overthrown in a coup. On the night of August 13th, President Machado fled the country, carrying off bags of gold from the National Treasury and eventually settling in Florida. But before we continue, I would like to take a moment to thank the channel members and patrons for helping keeping Casual Historian going. These supporters help keep the channel going when the algorithm or the sponsors don't feel like giving the videos a fair shake. And quite frankly, I would prefer to be a little more dependent on direct support of viewers than on AdSense. Supporters get a number of perks, such as access to an exclusive Discord server, as well as getting your name and the scrolling chyron at the end of videos, as well as early access to ad and censorship-free versions of the videos. And depending on which level or tier you join at, you also get access to the scripts I use to make the videos, as well as the notes that I use to make those scripts. But at the end of the day, I know that most people who choose to support me or any other creator is because they think what we do has value. They like the videos we make and they want to see us make more and better. And with your support, we can. And so if you believe that you do get a lot out of these videos and you have the means to do so, then I would suggest becoming a channel supporter. You could click the join button below this video, or you can go to patreon.com/casualhistorian and choose a membership tier that's right for you. The current difference between channel memberships and Patreon is that at the moment, Patreon has more options in case you want to give additional support. And Patreon also offers annual subscriptions, whereas channel memberships at the moment only offer month to month. So thanks to all the patrons and channel members, past, present, and future, for supporting this channel and making these videos possible. But for now, let's get back to the history. The US ambassador tried to set up a provisional government with a general taking power, who then handed it over to the new Secretary of State, Dr. Carlos Manuel de Cepeda. The upper ranks of the military were supportive, but the provisional government was unable to restore order. Cepeda would be in power for less than a month, when an insurrection of army sergeants, led by Fulgencio Batista, removed the president and the generals from power. The sergeants had worked with a radical socialist student movement who tried to set up a civilian junta, but after 5 days they gave up and appointed Dr. Ramon Grau San Martin of the University of Havana as the new provisional president. Grau's government would be revolutionary, with some members openly referring to it as socialist. President Grau would issue numerous decrees, placing caps on land ownership and ordering the confiscation and redistribution of excess lands, as well as instituting new taxes and wage increases. But the Cuban business community refused to obey the decrees or to even pay taxes, assuming the US was on the verge of intervening and reversing all of these policies. But the Roosevelt administration would disappoint all parties involved. The United States desires that complete and constant information about Cuba shall be available for the Latin American countries. The United States has absolutely no desire to intervene and is seeking every means to avoid intervention. The key of American policy in regard to Cuba is that Cuba shall obtain quickly a government of its own choosing, and one capable of maintaining order. Obviously, the business community, both the Cuban and American, were upset by this because the continued instability, along with Grau's policies, were costing them. The US ambassador in Havana was also worried the administration's refusal to intervene would lead to the creation of a communist state in the Americas. The Cuban military, or at least the ousted generals, were also asking the State Department to intervene. But the most upset party was Grau's government. With the US refusing to grant official recognition, large swaths of Cuban society refused to cooperate with the new Cuban government, which made it more difficult to restore civil order and thus allow for new elections to politically legitimize Grau's regime. And so, a US policy of non-interventionism results in the further destabilization of Cuba. After a conversation with the US ambassador, Batista tells Grau that the only way to obtain US recognition for the Cuban government was for him to resign. He would do so on January 18, 1934, with Carlos Medieta installed as the new provisional president. However, Medieta was merely a puppet of Batista, who controlled the government from behind the scenes. In spite of this, Batista's shadow regime was actually quite progressive and achieved many of the revolution's goals, including the abolishment of the Platt Amendment with US approval. In addition to the abolishment of the Platt Amendment, it was under Batista that women were finally given the right to vote. He also retained a large number of Grau's reforms, legitimizing them via legislation from the Cuban Congress. By the late 1930s, Batista was proposing the creation of a new constitution and invited all Cuban exiles who had fled during his, Machado's, and Grau's regimes to participate in the Constitutional Convention. This new constitution would be adopted in July of 1940, which had many of the legislative reforms enshrined, such as the national minimum wage, equal pay, paid vacations, 8-hour workdays, paid maternity leave, and the rights to organize and strike. It also outlawed landholdings above certain amounts and restricted foreign ownership of land. It was under this new constitution that Batista would run for president in his own right in 1940, winning over 58% of the vote. Batista's presidency saw Cuba's first official diplomatic relations with the Soviets. This wasn't too difficult a decision for Batista, since his party was allied with the Democratic Socialists in the Cuban Congress. During World War II, the US had released a number of Soviet spies and agents from prison to appease Stalin, and Batista would do the same by legalizing the Communist Party in Cuba, who would remain close allies of Batista until the end of his regime. Batista would step aside from formal power in 1944, not running for re-election, allowing Ramon Grau San Martin to finally achieve the presidency in his own right. Batista's regime had been pretty corrupt, with a practice known as ghost workers. Basically, various departments of the government would have a bunch of fake employees on the rolls, whose salaries would be pocketed by one or more officials. Grau was elected as a reformer in part to get rid of such practices, but he would end up supercharging them instead. After his presidency, Batista left the government and settled in Daytona, Florida, but he continued to exercise inordinate influence over the military, who were the true power behind the government, and could overthrow the president if needed. To build up his own power base within the government, Grau would mobilize the student gangs at the University of Havana to clash with Batista loyalists. He would hire them to work in the police and other government jobs, who would then use ghost workers to enrich themselves. I think I should take a moment to explain the situation at the University of Havana. You see, in Latin America, there's this concept of autonomous universities. These universities are publicly funded, but their operations, including staff and faculty, are entirely internal matters. This includes security and safety, which means the military and law enforcement are forbidden from setting foot on campus. This concept is a product of Latin American politics, in particular because their governments tend to be authoritarian, with the universities tending to be hotbeds of oppositions to said regimes. And so the universities would essentially become sanctuaries for political opponents of whatever regime was in power. But this also meant that the schools were responsible for maintaining order themselves, and when they weren't able to, they basically became breeding grounds for gangs and violent crime, as Havana had become in the 30s and 40s. Well, many of these gangs were politically left-wing, which is why Grau would recruit them, hire them into his government to fill various offices, and then use those gang leaders to direct violence against his political opponents. And it was in these gangs that Fidel Castro would get his political start, but we'll get to that a little later. Along with ghost workers and university gangs, basically all the governments of Cuba would be involved with the mob in one way or another. Ada Ferrer, author of Cuba in American History, says, "The relationship was so close that at times aspects of the Cuban state itself began to resemble the mob. Increasingly, political factions employed their own private security teams, who engaged in gangster-style violence. Some spectacular mob-style executions highlighted the resemblances for the Cuban public. People coined a new term for the style of politics of the period, an American word with a Spanish suffix, gangsterismo. But in the late 40s, there seemed to be a glimmer of hope for change. Grau had founded the Authentic Party to be a reform and anti-corruption party, but when it became obvious that Grau's government was just as corrupt as Batista's, a faction of that party, led by radio host Eduardo Chibas, broke off and formed the Party of the Cuban People, better known as the Orthodox Party. Chibas ran for president in 1948 against the Authentic Party candidate, Carlos Prio, and although he came in third, they did pretty well for a new party, winning 4 seats in the lower house of the Congress. But Chibas had a habit of riling up his supporters on his radio show, often making big, wild, bold accusations against people without much evidence. And one of these accusations would lead to his death. He would accuse President Prio's Minister of Education of secretly owning land in Guatemala. This became a very public dispute and resulted in the minister proving the accusations to be false, and Chibas would fall into a deep depression. He took to drinking and brought a revolver with him to one of his broadcasts, killing himself live on air. With Prio's corruption so blatant, Batista believed he could beat the Authentic Party in the 1952 election, but the polls were showing the Orthodox Party and its new leader, Roberto Agramonte, in the lead, despite Chibas' suicide the year before. So on March 10th at 2:40 a.m., junior officers seized control of Camp Columbia, the largest military installation in Cuba aside from Guantanamo Bay. By phone, Batista secures the support of army chiefs in other provinces, with all opposing officers ousted from the military. The next morning, when news of the coup began to spread across the country, Batista would publicly justify his actions by portraying it as a revolution against the corruption of the Grau and Prio governments, condemning their reliance on the violent gangs of Havana University. I mean, yeah, Grau and Prio were corrupt, but that was a bit of the pot calling the kettle black. And the only reason Grau and Prio were using the university gangs was because Batista refused to relinquish his influence over the Cuban military. In his memoir, which I'm kinda surprised exists at all, Batista claims that he did not repress any government employees at all so long as they were doing their job. What he fails to mention, however, is that part of doing their job was supporting him politically. The purpose of all these acts was to stabilize the country, to create as little upheaval as possible, gaining general confidence by seeking the national unity indispensable to progress, economic liberation, and consolidation. Now, in hindsight, it seems pretty obvious that Cuba was on the verge of violent revolution, but at the time there was plenty of reason to doubt it. Despite government corruption, the Cuban economy had grown, and the average standard of living had gone up. Many of the complaints of the communists who would come to take power in Cuba had already been addressed. By the 1930s, nearly 80% of Cuba's sugar industry was owned by American companies. But the reforms of Batista, solidified by the 1940 Constitution, encouraged Cubanization of the economy, with loans and other incentives provided for Cubans to buy up American assets in Cuba, and by the 1950s, the US owned less than half the sugar industry. And by 1958, that number went down to 35%. In fact, by 1954, sugar consisted of only a quarter of Cuba's economy, and only 44% of the Cuban labor force was working in agriculture. Not to mention that by 1959, Cuba had the 4th highest per capita income in Latin America, and the 31st highest in the world. Contrast that with today, where it's at 82nd. And it was this economic reality that kept most of the Cuban public, especially the middle class, on Batista's side until near the end of the revolution. During the coup, Prio would escape the presidential palace in disguise, and took refuge in the Mexican embassy, eventually going into exile in Florida. Students at the university began to demonstrate and waited there for weapons that President Prio was rumored to be sending. However, Roberto Agramonte told the Orthodox Party members to only use nonviolent resistance against Batista, and this would anger a young lawyer whose first run for public office had been quashed by the coup, and would begin recruiting other young members of the Orthodox Party to engage in violent revolution. This young lawyer was the 25-year-old Fidel Castro. The Castros were an upper-class family of the Orient province. Fidel's father was born in Spain and actually fought against Cuban independence in the 1890s, but chose to stay in Cuba after the war. Fidel himself would be educated at a Jesuit school, which gave him this weird combination of super puritanical tendencies, while also falling into the stereotypes of a philandering Latino with numerous children out of wedlock. After his primary schooling with the Jesuits, he attended the School of Law at the University of Havana in 1942, and would be part of the gang politics at the time. Random attacks and attempted assassinations were a common feature of campus life at the university, with some biographers crediting Castro's paranoid tendencies to these years. In the 40s, there were 2 major gangs, the Unión Insurreccional Revolucionaria, or UIR, and the Movimiento Socialista Revolucionaria, or MSR. The UIR was led by Emilio Tro, a volunteer for the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War, as well as the U.S. Army in World War II. The MSR was led by Ronaldo Mas Ferrer, an ex-communist who was an anti-American Cuban nationalist. And while in Havana, Castro was involved in at least one attempted assassination. And like all students with political aspirations, he was involved in the Federation of University Students, who were responsible for numerous riots and acts of terrorism, and were known to be affiliated with both communists and the mob. For Fidel, who was, despite his intellectual ability, very physically oriented, this violence seemed to have a certain appeal. Whether he found the violence itself attractive, or whether he viewed it as an unfortunate necessity in satisfying his ambition to become prominent student leader, is hard to say. And according to his own autobiography, he was quite an avid reader of Marxist literature while in college. He had many friends and acquaintances in the Communist Party and communist organizations, such as his brother Raul. He even bought a copy of Das Kapital while on his honeymoon in the US. I guess you could say he was seizing the means of reproduction. But he wouldn't join the Communist Party until 1961, at one point jokingly saying, "I would have joined the Communist Party if I could have been Stalin." But Fidel's education for revolution consisted of more than just gang violence and what I presume were insufferable dorm room Marxist reading groups. It also consisted of some practical experience as well. After World War II, a movement spread across Latin America to topple military dictators in what you could call leftist filibusters. Groups of private citizens, many of them university students and gangs, formed the Caribbean League and recruited fighters to join an expedition to oust Rafael Trujillo from power in the Dominican Republic. This movement was so popular amongst the gangs of Havana University that the MSR and UIR signed a ceasefire while this mission was underway. And in 1947, with his poll numbers shrinking, President Grau would support this mission as well, providing officers and equipment to train volunteers on an island off the coast of the Orient province, in which the 21-year-old Fidel participated. But after 2 months, Grau called off the operation and brought all the recruits back home after the U.S. State Department pressured him. And with the Trujillo mission called off, gang violence returned to Havana University. In early 1948, a government minister was murdered by a member of the UIR, and Fidel Castro was named as a suspect, which forced him into hiding. Around this time, President Juan Perón of Argentina was planning an anti-American student conference to be held in Bogota, Colombia, timed to coincide with a meeting of the Organization of American States. Fidel would be recruited by the Federation of University Students to join the Cuban delegation, thus giving him an opportunity to escape Cuba while the murder investigation continued. The student conference had a popular liberal Colombian politician, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, giving the opening address. But on April 9th, Gaitan was assassinated, which saw a lynch mob kill the assailant, which then exploded into a citywide riot, known as the Bogotazo. Fidel himself was involved in leading a group of rioters to a police station to steal weapons. As the riots calmed down, Fidel sought refuge in the Cuban embassy, as he was wanted for several murders. The Cuban representatives to the OAS conference, Guillermo Belt, unaware of Castro's misdeeds, arranged for his safe return to Cuba, by which point he was no longer wanted for the murder of the government minister. By the late 1940s, Fidel was trying to extricate himself from the gang politics of Havana University and found a home in Eduardo Chiba's Orthodox Party. But when the 1952 election came, Fidel was not endorsed by the party to run for his local seat in the Congress. In spite of this, Fidel decided to run anyway, but when the government was overthrown on March 10th, he would give up on electoral politics and return to the violence that he was all too familiar with. But Fidel wasn't the only one contemplating armed resistance. Although the Orthodox Party had officially eschewed violence, the Authentic Party would actively arm rebels, using organizations such as the Association of Friends of Aureliano, or AAA. Additionally, a Havana University professor with army connections, Rafael Garcia Barcena, founded the Movimiento Nacional Revolucionario, or MNR. Barcena, who was primarily recruiting from Orthodox Party youth organizations, had reached out to Fidel, who expressed interest. He used his army connections to procure arms for the MNR, and he hoped to use these connections also to initiate a bloodless coup to take over the government similar to Batista had. However, he wasn't careful in recruiting people to join his conspiracy, reaching out to so many different individuals and groups that his plot was eventually discovered, and he and about 14 other conspirators were arrested. Castro's own plans wouldn't begin taking shape until early 1953. He envisioned capturing the Moncada Barracks in Santiago to steal its arms and distribute them to anti-Batista rebels. As Fidel recruited his own Orthodox youth members, mostly from Spaniard families like his own, they received material support from Dr. Huto Carrillo, who led his own group, Acción Libertadora, and was the former head of the Agricultural and Industrial Development Bank. One of Fidel's earliest recruits was his brother Raúl, who was already involved in revolutionary communist student groups. Fidel claims to have both thoroughly investigated his recruits, while also doing it with haste. It went relatively quickly. I was amazed at how fast, using the right arguments and a number of examples, you could persuade somebody that society was absurd and that it had to be changed. Initially, I began the job with a handful of teams. There were a lot of people who were against theft, misappropriation of funds, unemployment, abuse, injustice, but they thought it was all attributable to bad politicians. They couldn't see that it was the system that created all of that. Castro would utilize Havana University's autonomy to train his troops, and he also claims to have started up several Marxist reading groups amongst some of the recruits. If we hadn't read Marx's books on political theory, and if we hadn't been inspired by Martí, Marx, and Lenin, we couldn't have conceived the idea of a revolution in Cuba. Those ideas were the essential building blocks of the revolution. But as Fidel was gaining manpower and arms, a conference of anti-Batista groups was held in Montreal, Canada. They came to a loose agreement to work together to overthrow Batista. But this worried Fidel Castro, believing this could steal the glory and the power that would rightfully belong to him as a result. So he decided to speed up his plans, hoping to not be usurped. Fidel rented a farmhouse in Siboney where his recruits would meet before the attack. They managed to procure a hodgepodge of various unmatching weapons and train them for several months, but during this time, Castro never really told his recruits what exactly they were going to do until the night before. His plan was to attack the Moncada Barracks in Santiago the morning of July 26, 1953. The day before was a festival celebrating a Cuban independence fighter, José Martí, and Castro had presumed that most of the soldiers would be sleeping off a hangover. Along with the Moncada Barracks, he also planned an operation at the nearby Bayamo Barracks to blow up a bridge in order to prevent reinforcements from reaching the Moncada. After detailing the plan, most of his recruits backed out, feeling it was a suicide mission. 160 fighters would participate in the attack, with 40 sent to Bayamo and the other 120 to Moncada. The Moncada group, which is where Fidel himself went, was split into 3 subgroups, one attacking a nearby hospital, another attacking a courthouse, and the main group attacking the barracks. The group confronting the barracks initially caught the soldiers off guard, the tired watchmen not noticing the uniforms the fighters wore were fake. But as Fidel tried to drive through the open gate, he hit a curb, which alerted a nearby army patrol jeep, which pulled up behind his group. Castro then jumped out of the car with a shotgun in hand, and a firefight broke out. The plan quickly fell apart, and after an hour, all of Castro's fighters had either fled the scene or had been captured by the army, and would be subject to interrogations and torture. About 60 of the participants made it back to the farmhouse and debated whether they should hand themselves over. Fidel would lead a handful of them to flee into the mountains, where they were eventually found by an army officer who had known Castro from university. Instead of taking the rebels to the army, who would have likely tortured them, this officer delivered them to civilian police on August 1, 1953. Those not already captured by the army or police fled the country, many going to Mexico City. Because he was sent to the civilian prison, Castro and those with him would receive trials, which gave Fidel the chance to pontificate and grandstand on the witness bench, justifying his actions, saying, "History will absolve me." Both Fidel and Raul would receive 13-year sentences and be sent to the Presidio Modelo on the Isle of Pines in the Gulf of Batabano. Castro was initially kept in solitary confinement, but less than a year into his sentence, he was actually offered clemency and release, and all he had to do was promise to not try to overthrow the government again. And he refused. Decades later, Castro continued to claim that his plan was flawless and could have overthrown Batista. The Moncada Barracks could have been taken, and if we'd taken Moncada, we'd have toppled Batista without question. If I were to organize a plan for taking Moncada Barracks again, I would do it exactly the same way. I wouldn't change a thing. What failed here was that we lacked sufficient combat experience. While Castro and crew were in prison, life and politics continued on in Batista's Cuba. Batista used the attacks as an excuse to arrest a large number of political opponents, including members of the Orthodox and Communist parties, due to many of the attackers being linked to their groups. Batista would hold an election in November of 1954, where he hoped to legitimize his coup. During the campaign, former President Grau promised to grant pardons to the Moncada attackers, who had gained public sympathy over news of horrendous torture many of them suffered in the week after. Batista would promise to grant a blanket pardon to not only the Moncada rebels, but also to any and all Cubans living in exile. These pardons would include Fidel and Raul, who would be released in May 1955. Batista would later justify these pardons by minimizing Fidel's involvement, even claiming he was never at the barracks and instead had spent the entire ordeal at the home of Enrique Perez Rantes, the Archbishop of Santiago, receiving literal sanctuary. However, pardoning Castro wasn't unusual at all. Historians have sometimes considered Castro's amnesty to be Batista's greatest error of judgment, but hindsight is the purview of historians, not politicians. There was nothing noteworthy about Batista's decision. If anything, Fidel's pardons suggest how little observers at the time, Batista included, made of Castro's threat to the state. In reality, it was university radicals who were the bigger threat to Batista. One of these student groups, the Revolutionary Directorate, led by Jose Antonio Echeverria, organized terrorist cells, protests, strikes, and boycotts. They would be responsible for a wave of violent assassinations throughout the 1950s, killing police officers and government officials. After his release from prison, he was initially planning to stay in Cuba and work with the Orthodox Party, while also simultaneously planning another violent attack against the regime. But when he got out, he found that the population of Cuba was less in the mood for violent revolution. He also found rivals for leadership amongst those who had survived the July 26th attacks, who had begun calling themselves the July 26th movement. He also had difficulty participating in non-violent politics because the parties, as well as most publications, had an unwritten agreement with Batista to not publish, work with, or cooperate with Fidel. The final straw was when Raul sought refuge in the Mexican embassy after he was accused of planting a bomb in a movie theater. He was granted political asylum by the Mexican government and allowed to resettle in Mexico City. Fidel planned to join him there, but not before organizing what was left of the 26th of July movement, as well as meeting with Professor Barcina, who agreed to formally fold the MNR into Fidel's group. He would leave Cuba on July 7, 1955, and follow his brother to Mexico. Fidel and Raul would join a large community of Cuban exiles living in Mexico City, where they met many of their future comrades who would follow him back to Cuba. The most famous of these was a young physician from Argentina, Ernesto Guevara, more famously known as Che. Che had been on a trip around South America and had arrived in Guatemala in 1954, shortly before the coup. Biographers of both men like to credit Che with radicalizing Castro against the U.S. The Castros would also become friends with Lázaro Cárdenas, a former president of Mexico, who would buy and store weapons for them and help the Castros out of prison several times. There's also a pretty high chance that Castro had contacts with the KGB. Nikita Khrushchev claims they never aided Fidel before he took power, but they were well aware of him through their direct contacts with Raul. However, our people who handled Latin American affairs and who had traveled in the area did know some of the Cuban leaders. They knew Raul Castro in particular. Based on information gathered through various channels, we knew that Raul Castro was a good communist. But more important were the ties Castro made with other Cubans. Students and other young radicals from Cuba would travel to Mexico to visit Fidel, in particular Echeverria, other revolutionary director in Havana, and Frank Pai of Santiago. He came to an agreement with Echeverria that the Directorate and the July 26th movement should avoid conflict and work together to overthrow Batista, even if they had different tactics. The Directorate would try a more top-down approach to the revolution by assassinating various high-level officials in the regime, including, hopefully, Batista himself. In contrast, Fidel wanted to recreate the revolution of 1933, which included a rural insurgency combined with general strikes in the urban areas. And this is where Frank Pai comes in. Pai would be directly incorporated into the movement and named the Chief of Action and Sabotage for Eastern Cuba, which was where Fidel was hoping to eventually land an invasion force. Fidel's period of exile wasn't limited to hanging out in Mexico City. He would visit Cuban communities across the Caribbean and the United States, raising money, recruiting fighters, and buying weapons, where he would get the attention of the FBI. Batista became aware of these activities and would send out his own spies to track down Fidel, and even sent assassins after him in Mexico City. But the attempts would fail, and none of this prevented politics from continuing on in Cuba. The legal opposition in Cuba had formed the Sociedad de Amigos de la República, or SAR, who would orchestrate rallies to protest the actions of the regime, pressuring it into making more concessions on civil and political rights. The July 26th movement and the Revolutionary Directorate opposed their actions because peaceful progress would eliminate the need for violent revolution, thus sapping support for their organizations. So the July 26th movement would disrupt SAR rallies, while the Directorate would commit acts of terrorism, which forced the regime to enact harsh reprisals that turned the public against peaceful resolutions. In April 1956, a conspiracy led by Colonel Ramon Barquin, backed by Justo Carrillo, who had been backing several rebel groups, was uncovered. A cadre of army officers, with support from Cuban exiles and President Trujillo of the Dominican Republic, were plotting a coup against Batista, and during the interrogations, Barquin claimed that both Trujillo and Prio were backing Castro as well. After the failed conspiracy, both Carrillo and Prio would reach out to Castro to begin supporting them directly, with Carrillo meeting up with Castro clandestinely along the Guatemala-Mexico border. Fidel would then meet with Prio in Texas, who pledged $50,000 to the July 26th movement. It was around this time that Castro's plan began to take actual shape. He meets with Frank Pai in September, where they plan for Pai's group to cause a disturbance in Santiago, which would distract the military long enough for Castro to land the men he had been training on the coast of the Orient province. His men would raid an armory near the landing site and then distribute the weapons to anti-Batista forces, similar to his Moncada attack plans. and from there wage a guerrilla war from the mountains until enough support could be built up in the cities for a general strike. Both Pai and Echevarria would criticize Fidel's plan, but he was always dead certain on his tactical brilliance. The men whom Castro recruited for this revolution mostly came from middle-class families, despite what his mythologizers have tried to romanticize as a peasant rebellion. Despite not having the material or manpower to do the job, Castro had made many very public statements reported in Cuban newspapers and magazines, claiming that he would return to Cuba before the end of 1956. And so, in order to keep this poorly thought out promise, he decided to speed up his timeline. After evading police raids, he and 81 recruits, including his brother Raul and Che, would load into a 58-foot motorboat named the Granma with arms, heavy weapons, and other supplies. And similar to his Moncada plans, he kept the details and timing of the operation secret from everybody until the day of. In the early AM hours of November 25th, 1956, the overloaded motorboat took off from Tuxpan, Mexico, and set sail for Cuba. In their minds, the revolution had finally and truly begun. If you're still watching the video at this point, then you must really enjoy my content, but you might be on the fence about whether or not to support the content, especially on an ongoing monthly basis. Well, luckily for you, we have alternatives. You can give a one-time contribution to Casual Historian via PayPal, or you could buy me a book from my Amazon wishlist. Doing the latter option, not only are you covering the cost of some of my research material, but you'll also be nudging me in the direction of one topic or another, depending on which book you get. Both of those options, as well as a secret third thing, can all be found down in the description below. Thanks for your considerations, and now let's get back to the history. Fidel originally planned to arrive at their landing site on November 30th, 1956. But between the Granma being overburdened by men and munitions, along with bad weather, delayed their arrival by 2 days. This delay would have disastrous consequences for their allies back in Cuba. Frank Pai and Santiago, along with the Revolutionary Directorate in Havana, planned to launch simultaneous attacks to provide Castro cover to land in eastern Cuba, but they were unaware that Fidel was behind schedule. In Santiago, Frank Pai's group launched attacks on the police stations, the Moncada Barracks, and the customs house, but they were quickly overpowered. As the Directorate and the Communists saw the Santiago attacks falling apart, they decided to call off their own plans in Havana. And the attack failed in almost every conceivable way. The purpose of the attacks was to provide Castro with cover so he could land his troops unmolested. But since he was behind schedule, he didn't have cover when he finally did land, which made the entire attack a waste. But even worse than that was that the preemptive attack alerted Batista's forces to Castro's imminent arrival, which would have some devastating near-term consequences for Castro's revolt. On December 2nd, the Granma was hit by Cuban artillery and air power, killing most of Fidel's recruits and sinking most of their weapons. The handful of survivors waded their way to shore, evading strafing fire from Batista's air force. When they finally made landfall at Las Coloradas Beach, they were 2 miles south of their planned landing area, with nobody on shore waiting for them. They were quickly discovered by Batista's rural guard, who chased them into the mountains, where Castro and crew eventually lost them. After several days of chasing, it was reported by an American journalist in Cuba that Castro was dead. These reports were repeated by the officers leading the operation against Castro, which led to Batista accepting them as true. And for the next 3 months, Batista continued to assume Fidel was dead, and thus called off the search and withdrew the troops from the Orient province. Castro and crew were able to use this lull to escape deeper into the Sierra Maestra, set up a camp, and familiarize themselves with the terrain, and make contact with Frank Pai and their other allies in the cities. But nobody was going to rally around a movement that was dead, and so Castro had his urban allies begin to spread a rumor that he was in fact alive, and he would use his ties to Cuban newspapers to score a huge media coup. They arranged for an interview with a New York Times journalist, Herbert Matthews, whose articles are treated by most of the literature as being credited with reviving Castro's political careers and turning him into an international celebrity. I will not deny that as I sat with Fidel Castro, his brother Raul, Che Guevara, and others up in the Sierra Maestra on the chilly morning of February 17, 1957, Cleo, the muse of history, touched me with her hand, or whatever she uses. The resulting publicity in the Times gave Castro and his guerrilla band a nationwide and even worldwide fame that, chronologically, was the start of the most fantastic career of any leader the whole course of Latin America's independent history. When Matthews arrived for the interview, Fidel put on a show to make it look like he had way more followers than he actually did. He would have his men sporadically interrupt the interview, giving cryptic messages about their troop movements, which Matthews would studiously jot down. In the interview, Castro would claim that he wasn't anti-American, but he did wish the U.S. would stop selling arms to the Batista regime. Matthews' article on his visit to the Sierra, published on 24th February, immediately made Castro an international figure. The imprecise overestimate of the size of Castro's forces helped attract urban Cubans to his cause. It was supposed that Castro was winning, that Batista's reports could not be any more relied on, and that his side was therefore the right side to be on. The article caused a stir within Batista's government, resorting to them denying the claims and citing their own reports as evidence, and then claiming that the New York Times was conspiring with anti-Batista rebels and terrorists. But then the New York Times published a photo of Herbert Matthews with Fidel Castro taken the day of the interview, at which point the Batista government had no choice but to admit that Castro had evaded them. Even I, influenced by the reports of the General Staff, doubted it. The interview had, in fact, taken place, and its publication was of considerable propaganda value to the rebels. Castro was to begin his era as a legendary figure and end as a monster of terror. What worried Batista about the article more than proving he had been outsmarted by Fidel was that it would give a huge boost of support for him. Recruits, mostly from the middle-class families, would meet with Fidel and his associates in the Sierra Maestra. Others would send money, food, and weapons to support the cause. But more importantly, I would argue, is how U.S. media would influence foreign policy at the time, as explained by the then U.S. ambassador to Cuba. Herbert Matthews served to inflate Castro to world stature and world recognition. Until that time, Castro had been just another bandit in the Orient Mountains of Cuba with a handful of followers who had terrorized the campesinos, that is, the peasants throughout the countryside. I believe that the policies are determined in the lower echelon, and by the time the higher echelon receives them, policies have already been made, and they have to live by them. And this wasn't the lone opinion of a bitter ambassador. Herbert Matthews would center the rest of his career on covering Cuba and singing Castro's praises, while also boasting about how he created the Castro everyone would come to know. In his 1980 book, Without Fear and Favor, the co-founder of the New York Times op-ed page, Harrison Salisbury, would admit that the Times had an outsized influence on U.S. policy, due in large part to their popularity amongst the lower-level staff and middle management at public institutions. In the spring of 1957, the U.S. State Department was looking to replace the outgoing ambassador to Cuba, Arthur Gardner. They initially chose Charles Bolin, the UN ambassador to Moscow, to succeed him in Havana, but instead would send him to Manila. This was most likely done because Bolin would have been less supportive of the State Department's new goals for Cuba. Ambassador Bolin was going to be transferred from Moscow to Havana? That was the plan a few months ago. Then the President and Secretary Dulles decided to send him to Manila. The decision is made that Batista has to go. You must be very careful. This conversation, according to Smith's 1962 memoir, alleges that the State Department was ready to let Batista be ousted from power as early as winter 1957. Bolin, like most U.S. ambassadors to the Soviet Union, either already was or would become very anti-communist by the end of his service. And what's likely happened is that they decided not to send him to Cuba because he would not be very willing to aid the overthrow of Batista, considering most of Batista's opponents either were or were at least accused of being communists. And the idea that Castro or the July 26th movement might be communist was already circulating within the State Department and the CIA. Former head of Western Hemisphere Affairs in the State Department, Sproul Braden, said in an interview with Human Events magazine that Castro was either a communist or their tool, and his victory would bring political and economic chaos and the tyranny of communism to Cuba. However, in the late 40s and early 50s, Braden was a lobbyist for the United Fruit Company and played a role in persuading the Eisenhower administration to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman of Guatemala in 1954. So many, especially today, would question his motives and his reasonings for this, but just because somebody has some amount of motivated reasoning doesn't mean they don't know what they're talking about. But Guatemala is a story for another time. Suffice it to say, both state and the CIA were aware of Castro's communist ties, including Raul and Che's direct involvement with communist parties, along with Fidel's involvement in the Caribbean Legion and the Bogotazo. Despite all of this, US media would have a disproportionate impact on US foreign policy in Latin America at the time, especially in the case of Cuba, in which the State Department would recruit Herbert Matthews to brief Ambassador Smith before his arrival. The significance of my briefing by Mr. Matthews is that it revealed the thinking and the aims of those influential sources in the lower echelon of the State Department at the time. For the views of the New York Times journalist on the Cuba situation were fully publicized. Smith would finally arrive in Cuba in June 1957, just months after a huge attack from the Revolutionary Directorate. Just as Castro and the July 26th movement were afraid of other anti-Batista groups taking the spotlight from themselves, so was the Directorate, despite their informal alliance. After the Matthews article in late February, Castro began to gain more attention and public support, which coincided with shrinking support for the Directorate. So on March 13, 1957, Echeverria launched an attack on the presidential palace. During the attack, a second group, led by Echeverria himself, took control of a nearby radio station, and in a broadcast announced that the dictator had been killed. The Directorate gunmen managed to shoot their way past the guards and get onto the second floor, where the president's office was. The explosions of the grenades and shots created a deafening noise. The shooting had intensified and the explosion of the hand grenades on the second floor could be felt. They found the president's office, but when they opened the door, he wasn't there. Reinforcements eventually arrived, and after several hours, all the assailants were dead, including Jose Antonio Echeverria, who was shot by the police while leaving the radio station. The Directorate had spent months planning the attack, discovering the layout of the presidential palace as well as Batista's daily schedule. 2 days before the attack, while visiting a school in Havana, Batista received a warning about the imminent attack. So he made sure that his wife and son were out of harm's way and changed up his schedule, taking a lunch meeting in a hidden room on the third floor of the presidential palace. He would spend the entirety of the attack in the room, with a phone in one hand and a pistol in the other. This failed attack irreparably weakened the Revolutionary Directorate, and from then forward, Castro and the July 26th movement became the primary armed opposition to Batista. And this was the environment Ambassador Earl Smith had to deal with upon arrival in Havana. Upon their arrival in Havana, they discovered several bombs were planted at the hotel that the delegation was staying at, and the Batista regime would accuse the July 26th movement of planting them, while Castro and crew would claim that this was a false flag attack by Batista. Smith was under instructions from the State Department to emphasize the U.S. neutrality in this conflict, even though both sides would complain that his non-intervention was a de facto support of the other side. Smith had scheduled a tour of Cuba in order to ascertain popular attitudes, and prior to a stop in Santiago, Frank Pye, the head of Castro's urban wing, was assassinated, with many suspecting the timing was intentional to minimize potential problems for the American diplomat. Despite the assassination, Ambassador Smith would keep his scheduled visit to Santiago. But Frank Pye's death, of course, resulted in a funeral, and that funeral would escalate into a general strike in Santiago, which local police would respond to quite brutally, which Smith would condemn in an interview, which got him in trouble with Batista's government. And while Smith was condemning Batista's government, the July 26th movement's actions would get bolder. On September 5th, 1957, an insurrection broke out at the Cuban naval base at Cienfuegos. The July 26th movement had infiltrated the Cuban Navy, and on the day of the attack, they allowed other movement members into the base, gave them weapons, and took a bunch of sailors hostage. The army eventually put the insurrection down, but during the investigation into the attack, they discovered that some of the instigators of the insurrection had been in contact with the CIA, operating out of the U.S. Embassy in Havana. The sailors and soldiers were under the impression that if they had successfully overthrown Batista, that the U.S. would recognize their government. The CIA agent who they'd been in contact with seemed to have been acting alone and claimed that the sailors and soldiers had misinterpreted what he had said. Needless to say, but the CIA agent would be removed from duty and sent back to the U.S. for punishment. But this whole incident made Ambassador Smith more worried about how wide and deep communist infiltration of Cuba and Castro's movement were. I made an intensive study into the background of Fidel Castro. I spent days talking to people who had known him from childhood. It was the unanimous opinion of these people that Fidel was an unstable terrorist. I was careful during this searching and exhaustive study to listen to sound and intelligent Cubans who were anti-Batista. They were outstanding professional men, intellectual leaders, and the clergy. No matter how anti-Batista these people were, they believed Castro would be worse for Cuba than Batista. The fall of 1957 saw the rest of the anti-Batista factions reorganize. The remnants of the Revolutionary Directorate abandoned their assassination campaign and adopted Castro's strategy of setting up a rural insurgency, operating in the Escambray Mountains. President Prio had attempted to send his own invasion force out of Florida, but his vote crashed and Prio was caught and indicted in New York for violating U.S. neutrality laws. These and other leaders would meet in Miami, Florida, coming to an agreement on a post-Batista government, forming the Miami Pact. But Castro refused to support the group, denouncing them as insufficiently revolutionary. And the winter of 1958 would bring the turning point Castro needed to not only defeat Batista, but to ensure he would come out on top. In early 1958, Radio Moscow begins openly supporting Castro, with the CIA internally acknowledging that the rebel leadership had been infiltrated by communists. Despite this, in January 1958, the State Department began advocating that they try to hasten the fall of Batista through the Havana embassy, which Earl Smith refused to endorse. Back in late summer of 1957, the Batista regime had suspended constitutional rights, claiming it would make it easier to capture, arrest, and sentence the terrorists who were planting bombs and assassinating public officials. But the Eisenhower administration had grown uncomfortable with authoritarianism in Latin America, believing it fostered anti-American sentiment. Smith informs his superiors at the State Department that Batista was in negotiations with the legal opposition to arrange for new elections and the restoration of constitutional rights, but that Batista was growing concerned with the U.S. slow-walking the delivery of arms and munitions they had ordered the previous year. In February, Batista agreed to hold new elections, allowing observers from the UN and OAS to observe their legitimacy, and restored constitutional rights. This happened simultaneously with efforts from the Catholic Church in Cuba to arrange a ceasefire between the rebels and Batista, hoping to get the July 26th movement to participate in the election. Batista would appoint opposition politicians to cabinet positions so that the country could be operating under a national unity government until the election. But when Castro refused to accept any peace agreement with Batista, or any government with him present, the cabinet resigned en masse, leading Batista to appoint the foreign minister, Gonzalo Güell, as prime minister. Batista, the strong man, had been willing to mediate, but not Fidel. As a result, Castro became the man of the hour and his prestige grew, while Batista's declined because his willingness to mediate was interpreted as a sign of weakness. Batista tried to create an atmosphere in which, at the very least, an election would seem fair, which would require the restoration of constitutional rights. But it also meant the destruction of the Castro movement. Who was derailing the election by threatening to assassinate or execute anybody who participated, scaring off both candidates and voters. But in March, Batista's government would announce the resuspension of constitutional rights, justifying on the grounds that they needed to go after Castro's terrorism. But this action would result in the U.S. bringing down the hammer that ultimately defeated Batista. On March 14, 1958, the State Department suspended the shipment of arms purchased by the Cuban government. Thanks to his spies in the Cuban embassy in D.C., Castro was informed of this development. The State Department had been pressured into this act by Congressman Adam Powell and Charles Porter. There were many orders that had not yet been delivered, which the Cuban government would cancel, hoping to purchase weapons from other countries such as the Dominican Republic, the United Kingdom, and Italy. Smith would also discourage the State Department from publicly announcing the suspension, fearing it would increase the morale of the rebels. I am impartial as far as the government is concerned to the political opposition. However, there is no individual group ready to take over the government of Cuba. I feel it is incumbent on me to do everything possible within my limits to obtain a peaceful solution. If Batista should abdicate or be overthrown, there unquestionably would be bloodshed, chaos, and vandalism. This would mean the sacrifice of many lives, including many innocent victims. The madness of the crowd or mob psychology is a frightening thing. The Cuban military was not prepared to defeat Castro with their current arsenal, lacking both arms and properly trained soldiers. The suspension of arms sales to Batista coincided with an increase in shipments of arms to the rebels, much of which were coming from the U.S. via Mexico, Venezuela, and Costa Rica. The bad news for Batista was piled on in March, as just 2 days before the U.S. ceased arms shipments, Raul Castro opened a second front in the Sierra Cristal Mountains, with Che Guevara opening a front in the Escambray, where they took control of local villages, established their own governing institutions, and began collecting taxes. The rebels increased the frequency of their attacks, planting bombs in public spaces, setting fire to sugarcane crops, and hijacking commercial aircraft, all in order to demonstrate that Batista couldn't maintain law and order. Batista retaliated against Castro's terror campaign with his own harsh reprisals, with arbitrary arrests and torture, which turned public sentiment, including that of the Cuban middle class, against him. The answer is that it did not defeat Batista's army in any military sense. It succeeded in making Batista destroy himself. Batista's answers to the terror was counter-terror. The orgy of murders, tortures, and brutality sent tremors of fear and horror throughout the entire Cuban people, and especially the middle-class parents of middle-class students. The Eisenhower administration wanted to stay out of the conflict at all costs, but that didn't stop Castro from trying to drag them in. While this civil war was going on, the U.S. still maintained their naval base at Guantanamo Bay, home to 2,500 U.S. Marines along with 2,500 of their relatives. But it's located in the Orient Province, which was the heart of Castro's rebellion, and got its water from the nearby water plant at Yateres. And Castro's forces would sporadically tamper with it. Every time the water was tampered with, Batista would send soldiers to protect the plant, but would eventually pull them out to fight somewhere else, thus leading to the rebels attacking it again. In June 1958, Raul Castro issued an order to start kidnapping Americans in order to use them as human shields. And the first victims were off-duty Marines and sailors returning home from leave on June 27th. The capture resulted in Batista halting air attacks on the province, with the U.S. consul in Santiago demanding to know their whereabouts, as well as demanding their immediate release. The U.S. Navy was given permission to do their own flyovers to intimidate the rebels, who would respond to the Americans by demanding that Guantanamo Bay cease refueling Batista's air force, which had not happened at any point during the revolution, which exposed their true motive to procuring human shields. By this point, Fidel Castro had his own representatives in D.C. who were in regular communication with the Eisenhower administration, and the State Department would reach out to Castro through them to get the hostages released. The hostages were eventually released, but the Castros dragged out the process as long as possible in order to prolong the ceasefire. And when the hostages were interviewed afterwards, they confirmed that, yes, their captors were indeed communists, and some of them even recounted Raul Castro's girlfriend trying to convert them to communists. Raul would order more kidnappings in October, after which Ambassador Smith threatened that he would get the State Department to resume weapon shipments to Batista, which saw the release of the hostages after only 3 days. The new elections were scheduled for November 1958. Batista himself wasn't running, but his coalition was still expected to win, which worried the State Department, fearing that this wouldn't serve as a clean enough break for Castro, and thus not stop the rebellion. Batista's party, the Progressive Action Party, ran former Prime Minister Andrei Rivera Aguirre, with the Authentic Party running Dr. Ramon Grau San Martin again, with the Free People's Party nominating Dr. Carlos Marquez, with both Grau and Marquez calling for a truce and political amnesty after the election. But Castro issued Revolutionary Law No. 2, calling for capital punishment for all candidates running for public office. The election occurred everywhere except for the Orient Province, where the rebels were successful in intimidating voters away from the polls, as well as stealing ballot boxes in other jurisdictions. Between this and the anti-Batista opposition being split, Aguirre would win, but the US wasn't willing to guarantee their recognition of his government, despite him offering to restore full constitutional rights and hold a new election after taking office in February 1959. By the time of the election, the Batista regime was running on fumes. Soldiers were regularly deserting or surrendering to rebel forces. The Eisenhower administration said that U.S. forces would only be used to protect American citizens, in spite of U.S. citizens already being coerced to pay off rebels for protection. It was only in December 1958 that the State Department began to take Castro's communist ties seriously, with the CIA now claiming that Castro was a potential threat to U.S. interests in the region. Communists and other extreme radicals appear to have penetrated the Castro movement. If Castro takes power, they will probably participate in the government. Some advisors suggested they resume weapon shipments to Batista as the lesser of two evils, but Eisenhower rejected them, hoping some third option would appear and displace them both. The US had made the decision to not intervene unless absolute chaos broke out. In mid-December, Batista began shopping around various proposals for him leaving power and his succeeding government gaining US support, but at that time the US was just not willing to commit to any of his proposals. And when Ambassador Smith met with him, he reiterated the U.S. government's belief that Batista wasn't capable of restoring order, and that the U.S. was going to maintain a neutral position in the internal affairs of Latin American countries. But Batista would retort, "You have intervened in behalf of the Castros, but I know it is not your doing, and that you are only following your instructions." In the early hours of January 1st, 1959, Batista and other high-ranking members of his regime fled Cuba by plane, arriving in the Dominican Republic. A provisional government was designated, with Justice Carlos Piedra assuming the presidency, and General Eulogio Cantillo appointed Army Chief of Staff. But this was short-lasting. As dawn arrived, the first announcements of Batista's departure were broadcast across Cuba. But at first, people didn't believe it. Castro ordered his forces to attack Santiago and Havana, with Raúl marching toward Guantanamo City and Che moving on Cienfuegos, all falling without a fight. Having heard about Justice Piedra being made president, Castro refused to accept it and demanded that another judge, Manuel Urrutia, be made the provisional president. So Castro called for a general strike, which worked this time and managed to shut down the country, forcing the Cuban Supreme Court to not give the oath of office to Piedra. Rioting, looting, and vandalism broke out across the island. As the hours passed, it was finally accepted that Batista was gone, leading to the Cuban ambassador in D.C., Nicolas Arroyo, to resign the afternoon of January 1st, handing control of the embassy to the rebel delegations. Initially, there was hope in Washington when Castro picked Carlos Urrutia to be the provisional president, since he was a known moderate. But as time went on, they quickly found that more and more of the decisions of the government were just being handed over to Castro, regardless of who was appointed to what position. Urrutia had refused to recognize the Cuban Communist Party, but in late January, Castro overruled him and legalized it. Cuban delegates to the 21st Congress in Moscow proclaimed that they were the vanguard of the revolution against Batista. More and more decisions began being handed over to Castro, which resulted in many decisions being delayed, due to Castro spending most of his time traveling around Cuba giving speeches. But when Castro did get around to appointing people to positions, most of the important ones were filled with communists. A new ministry was created to advise on revolutionary laws and policy. Castro issued decrees abolishing the Congress, the military, and all political parties. They also allowed the confiscation of property and the death penalty without due process. Revolutionary tribunals were set up to try members of the old regime, with over 500 being executed by the end of March. When publicly criticized for this, Castro deflected by claiming that his death toll was nothing in comparison to the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Political prisoners were freed, while airports in Florida were crowded with Cuban exiles trying to return home. However, due to the ongoing general strikes, the harbors and airports in Cuba were shut down, leaving Americans stranded in Cuba. The U.S. would halt all flights from the U.S. to Cuba until flights out of Cuba were resumed. But Castro banned American airlines from flying people out of Cuba, and insisted that all passenger flights out of Cuba must be on Cuban airlines. The British and U.S. embassies began arranging for the evacuation of U.S., UK, and Canadian citizens by plane and ship. Rumors spread that the new Cuban government was going to demand Earl Smith's removal, due to his open hostility toward Castro. Ambassador Smith tried to arrange a meeting with Fidel, but decided not to after overhearing one of his public speeches, where Castro said there would be 200,000 dead gringos in the streets if the U.S. attempted to protect American property in Cuba. Smith would be recalled, with his last order being to deliver the letter formally recognizing Urrutia's government. By mid-February, the moderates in the government began resigning in protest of Castro's unilateral rule. After Jose Cardona resigned as prime minister, Castro would appoint himself as the new prime minister, followed by passing laws that drastically increased the premiership's powers, functionally transforming the presidency into a ceremonial office. During the revolution, Castro had made numerous pronouncements that he would hold elections within a year of taking power, but once he was there, he kept changing his mind about when elections would be held, and he would use the reactions of crowds to justify his decisions. Get used to the feeling of walking gently around the edges of a volcano that is liable to burst with sulfurous flames at the slightest provocation. Despite the growing concerns in the U.S. State Department and the CIA, the U.S. media was still in love with Fidel. The National Press Club would invite Castro to speak in April 1957. Castro would be joined by several ministers of his government who were hoping to seek financial assistance to repair Cuba after the revolution, but Fidel would explicitly forbid them from asking the Americans for money. A meeting with Eisenhower was requested, but he refused due to Fidel's increasingly anti-American polemics. as well as his refusal to schedule new elections.
Having personally become highly suspicious that Castro was a communist and deeply disgusted at his murderous persecution of his former opponents, I inquired whether we could not refuse him a visa. Advised that under the circumstances this would be unwise, I nevertheless refused to see him.
Instead, the administration would have Vice President Nixon meet with Castro, who had been one of the more vocal voices of anti-communism in the administration. In their talk, Nixon pressed the importance of holding free and fair elections to legitimize their government, and to be wary of the communists, to which Castro replied, "You in America should not be talking so much about your fear of what the communists may do in Cuba, or in some other country in Latin America, Asia, or Africa. You should be talking more about your own strengths and the reasons your system is superior to communism or any other kind of dictatorship." Nixon would write a memo about Castro for the administration, saying that he was either incredibly naive about communism or under communist discipline. My own appraisal of Castro as a man is somewhat mixed. The one fact that we can be sure of is that he has those indefinable qualities which make him a leader of men, whatever we may think of him. He is going to be a great factor in the development of Cuba and very possibly in Latin America affairs generally. Eisenhower's memoirs would summarize quite succinctly why Castro would be so difficult for the U.S. to deal with.
Fidel Castro was a hero to the masses in many Latin American nations. They saw him as a champion of the downtrodden and the enemy of the privileged who, in most of their countries, controlled both wealth and governments. His crimes and wrongdoing that so repelled the more informed peoples of the continent had little effect on the young, the peons, the underprivileged, and all others who wanted to see the example of revolution followed in their own nations.
Back in Cuba, the new government was implementing its agrarian reform laws, which capped land holdings and confiscated properties, compensating people in what was universally recognized as worthless 20-year bonds, worth far less than the market value of the seized assets. These laws also forbid evictions, as well as the sale of land to foreigners. The U.S. demanded that the Cuban government compensate American citizens in cash, which Castro refused. These acts intensified the accusations of communism toward Castro, including by his own agricultural minister, who resigned in protest, which was followed by Castro purging the entire cabinet against the wishes of the president, who criticized the growing communist influence over Fidel. But in the summer of 1959, Castro performed a political stunt that forced Urrutia to resign. At this point, Castro was still denying his communist ties and claiming that he was pioneering a third way between communism and capitalism, completely ignoring the historical context that third wayism is usually a euphemism for fascism. And many Cubans didn't like the direction Castro was taking Cuba, believing that he was betraying the revolution. The most recent waves of exiles fleeing Castro began organizing against him, some flying planes over Cuba and dropping leaflets. But as the accusations of communism grew, support for Castro in Cuba also grew, with many believing that this was a prelude to a Guatemala-style coup. People would boycott anti-communist newspapers, and workers at some newspapers would go on strike in protest of editorial decisions, which led some editors to flee to the US. But it wouldn't take long for Castro's third way to start looking like stereotypical communism. In February 1960, Cuba reopened diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Premier Nikita Khrushchev sent Deputy Premier Anastas Mikulyan to meet with American businessmen, and while in the hemisphere would visit Fidel in Cuba. On top of reestablishing relations, they also created a trade agreement, with the Soviets agreeing to buy 20% of Cuba's sugar in exchange for oil and capital goods. Castro was no longer sitting on the fence. He was beginning to behave like a full-fledged communist, even though he still didn't call himself one. He was enlisting communists into his government. The Eisenhower administration began to encourage other Latin American countries to open themselves to foreign investment in hopes that improving their economies would raise the average standard of living, thus making it harder for Cuba and the Soviets to export revolution. But due to Fidel's high popularity amongst the poor of Latin America, these governments were afraid of openly condemning or opposing him, which scared off the desired foreign investors. This eventually resulted in the CIA, with strong encouragement from Nixon, to begin recruiting and training Cuban exiles for a potential counter-revolution against Castro.
I realized that the time seemed to be rapidly approaching when the United States would probably have to modify its historic reluctance to push officially for political and social changes within the countries to which it was supplying economic help. We would not only have to bring the American nations together in a collective effort to protect the hemisphere from communist imperialism, we would also have to organize the same kind of collective action to end within individual countries traditions of economic injustice by which the rich continue to get richer and the poor poorer.
In the summer of 1960, Castro tried to coerce the American-owned oil refineries in Cuba to refine the oil imported from the USSR, but they refused. This resulted in the Cuban government taking over operations of the refineries, to which the US retaliated by cutting its sugar quota purchases. And on August 6th, Castro announced the nationalization of all American property in Cuba, which was followed by the nationalization of all Cuban-owned sugar mills in September. Back in July 1960, Nikita Khrushchev threatened to use rockets to protect Cuba against attacks by the US. The administration initially ignored this, but a week later, Allen Dulles told President Eisenhower that a number of large, unidentified packages were delivered to Cuba, and that one of Cuba's military bases had been cut off from public view. The administration began to suspect that the Soviets were planning to place short-range missiles in Cuba, but it couldn't be confirmed. They could, however, see Cuban soldiers being trained on high-grade military equipment from the Eastern Bloc. This was followed by Castro giving a fiery speech at the UN in the fall of 1960, attacking the US. On January 3, 1961, the US announced that it would close its embassy in Havana, formally cutting off diplomatic relations with Castro's regime. Despite all of that, John F. Kennedy had been advised by the liberal historian Arthur Schlesinger to take a softer approach to Castro during the 1960 election.